Okay, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you can hear me. I'm Doreen, and I will be running the session for most of the session. And we are just going to dive right into the presentation. As advertised on our LinkedIn, on other social, we are going to be having this webinar about psychometrics and understanding psychometrics in the workplace. And I'm going to take you through a presentation that I prepared about the topic, but I'm also hoping for this to be a very engaging session and to hear from you about your experience with psychometric tests and other assessments in the workplace. And I'm hoping that it'll be a learning experience for both of us. And we get also have some fun. So welcome. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen card. Right. So as I shared before, we're just going to be discussing psychometrics in the workplace and particularly covering at least the basics of what it means, how it works, and why it matters, particularly for human resource personnel in organizations. Just a few housekeeping rules before we start. If you could please turn your camera on and your microphone off, that would be amazing. But also, if you have any questions, please feel free to type the questions in the chat. I have my colleagues here in the call who have agreed to help me just put those together, and I will address them at the end of the call after the presentation. And so feel free to share any concerns or questions that you may have in the chat as the presentation is going. And after the presentation, I will make sure to address them. Yeah, so just to introduce myself a little bit more. My name is Doreen Malavanu, and I am a work psychologist. Currently, I'm working at Zanga African Metrics as a research and development lead. And I recently completed my master's in work psychology at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And I'm very happy to be working with Zanga because I feel a great alignment in terms of the work that we're doing, my interests and our values in general. So Zanga as a company offers assessment and analytics for high context cultures. And when I talk about high context cultures, this does include a lot of the African nations and the culture that we have, and some parts also of Asia. Essentially, it's cultures that are quite complex, and especially in terms of how we communicate and how we relate to each other. It's more implicit, it's more nuanced compared to the ways that low context cultures, for example, like the UK, where I did my master's, the US and other countries relate and communicate with each other. And so as a company, we realize that because of the nuanced culture and values that we have, there is a need to have assessments that reflect these complexities. And especially when it comes to leadership, developing leaders, we definitely need tools that reflect the complexity in our culture and can serve the people who have this culture, like ourselves. And so I'm very excited to be working with Zanga as a research and development lead to continue developing our products, but also to continue doing further research into our culture and into our tools and how we can continue creating tools that are relevant for us in the workplace as we aim to develop this. Right. So just before we start, I had a look at some of the participants who will be joining us today, and I did notice that quite a big chunk are from HR or in related field. And so I just wanted to hear a bit about your experience with psychometrics or with workplace assessments. You can feel free, please, to write about your experience in the chat. But I wanted to know if you could share with us if you've ever been asked to take a personality test or some type of written, whether it was like a cognitive ability test as part of a recruitment process. And I'm also quite curious to know how you felt about the exercise and if you had any reservations or concerns about using such assessments in our workplace. So I'll just give us a few minutes to answer these questions in the chat. It doesn't have to be a long answer per se, just I'd like to know more about your experience. So yeah, please feel free to write it in the chat. But as you do so, I will also share my own experience. Prior to me pursuing my work psychology master's, where I got to learn more about psychometrics and workplace assessment, I remember applying for a job at a certain company, and I was asked to fill in a personality assessment. And I was quite confused, and I remember thinking, but what is this for? Because I saw the job role and I was quite confident that I could do the jobs. I didn't see the point of a personality assessment. But now I'm standing kind of on the other side and having learned the benefits and having seen how they elevate the recruitment process. I can definitely advocate for their use. But yeah, if you could also share your experience, if anything, how you feel about workplace assessment. Okay, so I'll leave the chat open just for that in case anybody else wants to share. Oh yeah, we have a comment. Good afternoon. I've worked with psychometrics before. The results were quite interesting, almost 100% true. Oh, that's a great experience. I'm glad that you found the results interesting and 100% true. Psychometrics can be a way to gain a lot of insight into ourselves, but also into other people into teams. Yeah, so I'll be happy to hear any other experience. If anybody else wants to share, please, you can drop a message in the chat. For now, we'll just continue with the rest of the presentation. So for today's presentation, we'll cover a brief introduction into psychometrics. We'll discuss a few types of psychometric assessments. We'll also discuss why psychometrics matter in HR and in people development. And we'll go over some basics regarding how to identify the right psychometric assessment. So if these areas if you have any questions, for example, that you'd want to be addressed, you can, again, just leave them in the chat and we'll see if we haven't addressed them in the presentation, then I will address them at the end. So yeah, let's get right to it. So it's become quite common for people or for recruiters, for HR, for companies to ask people to complete some type of test in the recruitment process, but also in people development. So perhaps they want to do some sort of training or have some career counseling activity. And so the initial step or one of the steps that people are asked to complete in this process is some type of assessment. But having talked to some people here in Tanzania about the recruitment process, especially people who've been working for 20, 15, 30 years, they are quite of the opinion that this is, it wasn't common back then. It's something that we're starting to see more of recently. And as time goes, it's becoming the standard practice. And so because as African nations, we are kind of playing catch up with psychometrics, I think it's quite important to understand the basics so that we're able to utilize these tools as effectively as we can. And what I mean by we're playing catch up is if you look at the history of psychometric tools, these tools that measure psychological characteristics, you'd find that in the US and the UK, they've been used for over 100 years. And particularly, they were used because they are objective and efficient, and they can accurately predict performance. And essentially, psychometric tools include any type of tests or any assessments that are used to measure psychological characteristics, abilities, and traits. So things like personality, things like intelligence, things that we're not able to directly observe, so that psychological characteristics that we're not able to directly observe. These are measured through psychometric tests or psychometric assessments. If we think of something like length, so we use rulers, tape measures to measure the length of something, so like a table or a laptop or whatever it is. There's an agreed upon measure. And so for issues or for psychological qualities or characteristics, it's quite hard to quantify. So it's something like personality, it's quite hard to quantify. But psychologists have come up with theories which form the foundation of having these tools that can measure and compare and contrast between people and their individual differences. So essentially, psychometric tests help us to compare and contrast between individuals in terms of these psychological characteristics that are not directly observable. And this is quite the endeavor, this is quite the thing to be wanting to do. Like, why do we want to measure and quantify psychological characteristics? Being HR personnel, for some of us just being people who have worked in different fields for some time, we know that things like a person's personality or a person's problem-solving skills or a person's competency in areas like decision-making can be the difference, can be the differentiating factor between an employee who is average and an employee who is above average, way above average. So maybe the best performer. So we realize that these individual differences can be the means to identify people who can fit into roles, people who need some type of development to be invested into them so that they could they could perform even better. And so psychometrics as a field then aims to quantify these differences so that we can compare and use this information, whether it's for self-awareness, whether it's recruitment, whether it's for development purposes. And it's like I said before, it's been highly recognized as a way that is objective because we are removing kind of like a personal element to it. Efficient, so you can deploy or you can have a test that you send out to 100 applicants and they can fill it in and you get the result instead of interviewing, for example, 100 people, but also accurate because it's based on a systematic and statistical system. The predictions that come out of psychometric tests are quite accurate in terms of how effective or how good a person's performance will be in the workplace. And so there's quite a few types of psychometric tests. And if you look at the list, sometimes it seems like it's always increasing. There's always something new, but it's always related to these basic or common tests that I'm going to discuss. And one of the most common psychometric tests that we see out there is personality test. And for the workplace, personality tests that aim to assess how a person behaves, thinks, and feels in the workplace. And some examples of these are Myers-Briggs, the Big Five model. And some people would refer to personality test as behavior assessment. It's because essentially they measure the same thing. So it's how a person behaves, thinks, and feels in the workplace. There will be also some psychometric tests who specify that this is a workplace behavior assessment or workplace personality test, because as psychologists, we realize that in a lot of cases, people's behavior in the workplace is not the same as their behavior outside of the workplace. And so when it comes to a workplace personality test or workplace behavior assessment, it's important that the assessment reflects that this is that it's probing into how a person is likely to behave in the workplace and not outside, because those could lead to different behaviors and personalities that a person chooses to develop as. But another type as well is ability test. And so these tests essentially a person's cognitive ability. It could be general ability. So we have things like IQ tests. But we also have things that test specific abilities. So we have tests that test, for example, a person's numerical abilities, general reasoning, and verbal reasoning. And so for different from an HR perspective, from different roles, people would need different levels of these skills. And so a lot of psychometric tests that test ability are also designed to test different levels. So if it's an entry level role, for example, then it might, then after analyzing the job, we might find out that they actually just need a very basic understanding of maybe numerical skills. Maybe they want to be handling a lot of maths and plans in their role, but maybe they need more of like verbal reasoning. So in terms of utilizing ability tests, we have to be very cognizant of the roles, the level of the role that we are using it for, and make sure that it reflects the type of activities or responsibilities that a person has to undertake in them. But another type are competency assessments. So competency assessments, these come from specific competencies or specific skills that a company has identified to be relevant to. And actually, there are companies that have their own competency frameworks, but there are also companies like us who offer competency frameworks that we have assessments for. And our competency framework is specific for high-context cultures. And so leaders, employees within high-context cultures can take this assessment and see where they are, what level they're at in relation to specific competencies that are relevant to working in our context culture. But last, we also have situational tests. And these essentially are tests that aim to probe into a person's decision-making, problem-solving skills. So how they work is they give a person a scenario that is likely to happen at work. So maybe it's some type of dilemma, and they give a person options of how they would react or how they would respond to this situation. Some of them are ranked in order of what you're likely to do first, second, third, and fourth. Some of them just ask outright, what would you do, and give a number of options. And these are usually quite interesting because they're also used to test a person's values. And so typically the replies or the options that a person gets in situational judgment tests are tied to different values. And companies look for people who align with their own values. And so they're looking for answers as well. How a person answers that can reflect on their values and whether they align with the company values. But there's also, like I said, quite a few other types of psychometric tests. We have work samples where people will be given essentially a task to complete that is related to the role that they're applying for or working at. Motivation questionnaires, again, these are aimed to probe into a person's motivations or values when they're recruiting or even looking to develop into other roles. So yeah, these are the basic types of psychometric tests. Now, when it comes to psychometrics in HR, there is a few that I've covered in the previous conversation. I've already kind of covered this, but psychometrics uniquely offer HR practitioners great tools that help them in some of the ways that I have here on my screen. And the first one is standardized tools for key initiatives. such as selection, leadership development, and succession planning. So having a tool that is standardized, that is unbiased, is a great thing to have as an HR practitioner who's always looking to select people into roles, to develop leaders into so that they're able to drive organizational goals, but also to plan the pipeline now of who gets to undertake these leadership positions after people have retired or moved on to other positions. But also they offer a foundation for data-informed decision making. So a lot of decisions sometimes can be made with, not saying no data, but perhaps skewed data or biased data. And so this one, when we use psychometrics, we have solid data that can inform decision making in hiring, training, and development. And we do know that there is often bias. We're human beings, and inherently we have some type of bias that can show up as well in our roles when we're making decisions of who to hire, who to train, and who to develop into certain roles. But having, in the effort to be fair, in the effort to be just, using a psychometric tool will provide unbiased data that we can use to make decisions as HRs. Yeah, and again, psychometrics and psychometric assessments are quite efficient in terms of filtering candidates. So recruitment, I know, can be quite short, especially nowadays where you have growing rates of unemployment, and with every one role, you'd have hundreds of applicants often. And so deploying a psychometric tool in the early stages of employment can help you filter through these applicants. And I know there are other ways to filter through. So there's the applicant tracker systems, there's manually reviewing a lot of applications. But when you use, for example, an applicant tracker system together with the psychometric tool, it increases the accuracy or the filtering process, the quality of the filtering process, to make sure that the candidates that make it to the next level are candidates that are qualified, candidates that are maybe now, depending on what you're looking for, aligned to the values that you're looking for, or have the personalities that you're looking for, or have the behavior personality that you're looking for in that role and at your company. Again, for HR, psychometric tests offer the opportunity or the means to identify employee development needs. And so, we are always doing training, coaching, mentoring, and other ways as a way to develop the people in our organization. And so having psychometric tools that will give you insight into what a person is like, for example, how they behave in the workplace, their cognitive ability, how they're likely to respond in different situations, helps you to identify what they need in terms to develop in order to develop and perform better in their roles. And so this again can be used kind of like not just in the early identification, but also if you, for example, use it to identify development needs and then to deploy a development strategy, whether it's a training, coaching, mentoring, and then after a while, kind of monitor the progress of a person's development. So you can use the tool again kind of as a input to engage how a person has developed towards the goals that you want them or they want themselves to achieve. But also tools such as personality tests and other tools that look into a person's values and check whether they are aligned with the company values can be a way to kind of enhance the team building, alignment, and conflict management. What I mean by that is, for example, you recognize that people with different values can have a hard time working together. But when you have similar values, then it's easier to work as a team, to align on your goals, and to manage any conflict that arises. And so by using these tools, you can identify people's values and help them and help from the beginning, make sure that the team is working well. You're setting it up. Yeah. And here I also wanted to share a few considerations for when you're picking a test and also when you're using psychometric tests. So nowadays there's definitely a lot of psychometric tests available. And often they're measuring the same thing. So for example, we have a lot of psychometric tests that measure, for example, personality. There's so many personality tests, and it could be it's time consuming to go into the details of how it was formed and the theories and the models that were used to develop these tests. And often it's just too time consuming. But I wanted to share with you some things that we should definitely consider when picking what psychometric test to use for our organization. So the first one would definitely be the identification of the ability, skill, or competency that you're trying to test or you're trying to assess. And also why that skill, ability, or test is relevant for that role. So if you're hiring, then you know what a person needs. You've probably done a job analysis and thoroughly identified what skills and abilities or competencies this person needs to have. And so that should lead you towards what test would be relevant in that case. But also, as I mentioned before, it's important to keep in mind what level you're testing. So if it's an entry-level job, then that could be just general knowledge or general intelligence test. If it's a managerial role, so then it could be a second level or higher level of testing. If it's a C-suite, then it's probably, again, the highest level of assessment. But also another thing to consider is, does the content of the ability, or might not even be ability, could be personality test, look relevant to the test taker. So I think I shared my own kind of experience with assessments where I was a bit skeptical of why I was being asked to take a personality test while I knew that I could do the wrong. And it's essential for us as HR personnel, as people who want good quality applicants who can do the job, that these applicants are not turned away from the process by what we are asking them to do. And actually, a lot of research has found that if the test doesn't look relevant, if the test doesn't look like it's applicable, it involves things that are actually applicable to the job, then people might lose trust in the process and just think that you're making them jump through hoops in order to get the role. And so this also kind of brings us to how tests or where tests are made. And if tests, for example, are made in the UK, so a lot of the content, for example, the language and some of the examples might reflect a UK context that might be hard for people in Tanzania and Zambia to relate to. And so it's important to also look at where the test is designed and and for what context. And certainly that is the basis of our work at Zanga. We come from the cultural context, so we understand and we design tools specifically for this context, so that people are able to relate to the content that of the test and understand how relevant it is to themselves, but also to the roles that they're applying to. But also, it's for optimal use of psychometric tests. It's best to utilize a test in combination with another method. So, psychometric tests or these abilities, I think I read a paper that said they account for up to 50% of the performance differences, which means there's definitely other qualities and other things that contribute to a person's performance in the workplace. So when you use interviews, when you use, I think there's like direct observation and other methods in the recruitment process. It can give you a more generalized, more comprehensive view of a person's ability and fit into roles, or for a more comprehensive view of their development as employees. But also, it's important to use results as guides and not definitive answers. As I said, if we're using, for example, you're using it as a development tool, then you realize that you're hoping, I mean, whatever the tests, whatever results you get from that assessment, it's an indication of what the person's ability is at the moment. And if you're looking to then train or develop them in some way, for example, through mentoring and coaching, you're also acknowledging that it will change over time. And so you're using this as a guide to kind of tell you where the person's maybe strengths and development areas are, and recognizing that they may change in the future. And so we look at they are useful tools, but they do not tell us the comprehensive ability, or it doesn't represent the maximum potential that a person has or employee has. But also it's important to ensure the tools are validated and reliable. So when we talk about valid tools, is they should be measuring what they say that they measure. If it's a personality test, then we should ensure that it's actually measuring personality and not other psychological qualities. And in terms of reliability, so I'll give you an example. If you have two personality tests, and if I take two different personality tests and I reply to them in the same way, as in my answers are consistent, but one comes out as I'm an extrovert and another one comes out as an introvert, then there's definitely one of the tools there that had some type of issue. And so with reliability, when a tool is put amongst other tools that measure the same thing, then the result should be relatively the same. And this happens in psychology and in psychometric testing, because unlike length, where you definitely have a ruler or a tape measure to measure it, with psychometric testing or with psychological qualities, there's different theories as to how we can measure the same aspect. So that's why we have the Big Five, for example, as a model for measuring personality, but we also have other ways to measure personality because they're based on different theories. But overall, they should tell me the same thing. Like, it doesn't matter what test I take or how they frame their answers. If I'm honest in how I feel them, then it should be they should be telling me the same result. So usually tools that are out in the public should have this information with them. So it should tell you their validity and reliability scores before you use them. But also optimally be mindful of cultural and ethical consideration. The test should not ask people to do anything that's unethical, or again, we should be mindful of like the cultural considerations, like I mentioned. Make sure if it's a test that's been devised in another culture or another context, then that is well adapted, then it's relevant, and also that is relevant for the people that you're using it for. Yeah, so that marks the end of my presentation. I would definitely love to hear from you. And if you could also just type in the chat what was your most valuable takeaway from today's session.